Imagine for a second that you are walking into this completely ancient old-growth forest in Japan. You step off the main path, and almost immediately, this really dense, heavy silence just falls over you.
Oh, yeah, that classic feeling.
Right. The air suddenly feels thicker, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and you get this absolutely overwhelming, undeniable sensation that you are being watched.
It's visceral.
Totally visceral. Now, take that exact same feeling, but travel halfway across the world to a rocky, mist-covered valley in Ireland, or, I don't know, deep into the Amazon rainforest.
Mm.
Somebody out there is experiencing that exact same suffocating, awe-inspiring sensation.
At the exact same time.
Yes. And for centuries, across the completely isolated cultures, humanity basically blamed this feeling on invisible little people. Nature spirits, fairies.
Which is such a fascinating human reflex.
It really is. But the premise of our deep dive today is, what if they weren't just imagining it? What if their bodies were actually detecting real measurable physics that our modern instruments simply aren't calibrated to see?
And that right there is the crux of this entire mystery. I mean, we are just so accustomed to viewing folklore as, just a collection of quaint, primitive bedtime stories.
Yeah, totally.
But when you actually strip away the cultural costumes, like the pointy hats, the gossamer wings, all of that, you are left with this raw, globally consistent record of human beings interacting with an environment that is profoundly more complex than just, a collection of biological resources.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We are taking a deep dive into an incredibly fascinating, really highly structured academic and philosophical framework. It's known as the Prism of Odysseys.
Or the Prisme des Odyssées in its original French.
Right, the French text. And specifically, we are cracking open what the authors call Extension Ex Fior. This is a document that is entirely dedicated to investigating the little people, the elves, the fairies, the nature spirits.
It's a heavy document.
It really is. And I want to be super clear right off the bat, because I know exactly how this topic sounds to a lot of people. We are not here today to convince you to go leave a saucer of milk out on your porch for Tinkerbell.
No, definitely not. I mean, the goal of the Prism of Odysseys, and really our goal today, is not to ask anyone to just blindly believe in fairy tales.
Right.
The prism doesn't exist to affirm the biological existence of mythical creatures. But, and this is crucial, it also flat out refuses to cynically debunk these stories. It refuses to just write off thousands of years of human experience as mere ignorance or some kind of mass delusion.
So it's kind of walking this really razor-thin tightrope between belief on one side and skepticism on the other.
Precisely. It treats the source material as a rigorous, serious investigation into human perception itself. Instead of asking, are fairies real? It asks a fundamentally different question. It asks, what were generations of human beings actually perceiving that caused them to invent the concept of fairies in the first place?
Which brings me to this concept I saw in the notes you brought for today, the epistemic grid.
Yes, the grid.
Yeah, when I first read that term, I honestly thought we were getting into some incredibly dry philosophy seminar. But looking at how the prism actually applies it, it's a brilliant tool.
It's highly functional.
It is. Because if we agree that global folklore exists, how does the prism handle the messy reality of human testimony? I mean, if you throw a documented hallucination, a local myth, and a deliberate hoax all into the exact same bucket, you just end up with noise. You cannot study noise.
You absolutely cannot. And that is exactly why the foundational axiom of the prism is distinction. The epistemic grid is basically a way of categorizing the phenomenon into very strict levels so we don't contaminate our own investigation.
Right. Keep the data clean.
Exactly. So the very first level of this grid is acknowledging documented cultural folklore as an established anthropological fact.
Meaning the stories themselves are real, tangible artifacts of human history.
Yes. The universality of these narratives is not up for debate at all. I mean, from the Huldufolk hidden in the Icelandic rocks, to the Encantados lurking in the rivers of the Amazon, to the nymphs of ancient Greece, and the jinn in Islamic traditions, the cultural impact is a documented reality. The stories exist.
So that's the baseline.
That is the baseline from which all further inquiry has to start. We don't have to believe the jinn is literally made of smokeless fire to acknowledge that the concept of the jinn completely shaped the behavior, the architecture, and the psychology of millions of people.
Okay, I follow that. The folklore is the bedrock. But how does the grid handle the people who actually step forward and say, look, I saw one? Because throughout history, right up to the present day, You have perfectly sane, rational people who genuinely report experiencing something they can only describe as a nature spirit.
And that brings us to the second level of the grid, which the prism labels sincere human testimonies, or, in more philosophical terms, valid first-person phenomenology.
Unpack that term for us real quick. Phenomenology.
Sure. So phenomenology is basically the study of structures of consciousness as they are experienced from the first-person point of view. It means we take the experience of the observer seriously, completely, regardless of what actually caused it.
Okay.
So if someone is walking through a dense forest and they experience this profound, terrifying encounter with an invisible presence, the prism requires us to say, look, the psychological and physiological experience of this encounter was real for this person.
Right, their heart rate spiked, they felt the fear.
Exactly. We aren't saying their interpretation of the event is flawlessly accurate. We aren't saying they actually saw an elf, but we are acknowledging that they perceived a genuine stimulus. They aren't lying.
I see. So we separate the sincere experience from the cultural label that they placed upon it.
Yeah.
But that still leaves a massive vulnerability in the data, doesn't it? What about the people who actually are lying, the frauds?
Which is why the third level of the grid is so vital. It's the isolation of proven hoaxes, established fiction. The grid demands that we ruthlessly isolate known fabrications so they don't poison the well of sincere testimony.
That makes sense.
And the source material explicitly points to the famous Cottingley Fairies incident as the ultimate cautionary tale in this regard.
Oh man, the Cottingley Fairies. If you are listening to this and you aren't familiar with this story, it is just a wild chapter in the history of spiritualism.
It really is.
This was back in 1917 in a little village in England called Cottingley. Two young cousins, Elsie Wright and Frances Griffiths, took a series of photographs down by a stream at the bottom of their garden. And in these photos, you clearly see these young girls surrounded by little winged fairies dancing on the branches and in the grass.
And you have to remember, in 1917, photography was still widely regarded as an infallible record of reality.
Right, they didn't have Photoshop.
Exactly. People hadn't developed the visual skepticism we have today in the era of AI generation and digital editing. A photo was proof.
And these photos went absolutely viral for their time. They caught the attention of some incredibly prominent figures, but most notably Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the literary genius who created Sherlock Holmes.
The man of logic himself.
Yes, the man whose entire legacy was built on logic, deduction, and forensic reasoning. And Conan Doyle completely, unequivocally, fell for it. He wrote entire articles defending the photographs as authentic evidence of the spirit realm.
It is a stunning historical irony. I mean, the creator of the ultimate rationalist was fooled by two children. And this perfectly illustrates why the prism's epistemic grid is just non-negotiable. Conan Doyle failed to separate his deep personal desire for the supernatural to be real from the rigorous demands of objective analysis.
He mixed his data points.
He mixed them completely.
He wanted to believe so badly that he just lost his deductive edge. And it wasn't until decades later in the 1980s that the cousins finally confessed. They had literally just copied illustrations of fairies from a popular children's book, cut them out of cardboard, and held them up in the grass using hat pins.
A cardboard cutout and a hat pin.
That is what defeated Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. So the third level of the grid acts as a firewall. It sweeps away the cardboard cutouts, the charlatans, and the deliberate fictions. And once you do that, once you establish the anthropological folklore, validate the sincere phenomenology, and discard the hoaxes, you finally arrive at the fourth and final level.
The open questions.
Yes, the core of the entire document. The prism asks a deeply profound question here. Once you strip away everything else, what is the actual underlying stimulus that generations of humans have consistently interpreted as little people?
Right. What is the root cause?
Exactly. When a sincere person in an altered state of consciousness or isolated in a highly specific, dense, natural environment perceives an entity, what are they actually perceiving?
So the prism essentially treats elf ecology, the study of elves and fairies, not as some fringe pseudoscience, but as a vast universal library of encrypted human experience.
That's a great way to put it.
And the source notes point out a really fascinating consistency in this library. These beings are almost always described as semi-visible or invisible, and they are universally associated with the deep elements of nature. They inhabit the threshold.
The spaces between the worlds.
Yes, exactly. The deep woods, the damp caves, the twilight hours of dawn and dusk, the spaces where ordinary reality gets a little, blurry. But I do have to play devil's advocate here for a second, because as much as I love this framework, it feels incredibly difficult to execute in reality.
Oh, so.
Well, if we are using this grid, how do we actually draw the line between a sincere psychological projection, like a shared cultural hallucination,
Yeah.
born out of just a primal fear of the dark woods, and the actual perception of some non-ordinary environmental stimulus?
Hmm.
It feels like trying to weigh a cloud.
That is a brilliant analogy, but think about how meteorologists actually do weigh a cloud. You can't put a cloud on a bathroom scale, obviously. You need to understand atmospheric pressure, condensation, thermodynamics, fluid dynamics. You need a completely different set of scientific tools.
Right.
Similarly, the prism suggests that to understand what people are experiencing in these forests, we cannot rely solely on standard materialistic biology. We have to look at how history's brightest minds attempted to categorize these forces way before the vocabulary of modern physics even existed.
Which takes us right out of the realm of modern folklore and plunges us straight into the 16th century.
It does.
Because I was reading the prep notes on this next section, and I was genuinely shocked. The prism relies heavily on the work of Paracelsus. Born in 1493, a Swiss physician, theologian, and perhaps the most famous alchemist of the Renaissance.
A true polymath.
Yeah, and I always just thought of alchemists as guys in dark rooms trying to turn lead into gold. But Paracelsus was doing something much more sophisticated, wasn't he? He wasn't treating these nature spirits as metaphors or bedtime stories at all.
Far from it. Paracelsus viewed the natural world as a deeply interconnected living system. Around 1530, he wrote a treatise with a very long Latin title. It's the Liber de Nymphis, Sylphis Pygmes et Salamandris et Decatur Spiritibus.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, which essentially translates to the Book of Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, Salamanders, and other spirits.
And what he was doing with this book was basically building a taxonomy of the invisible.
Precisely. He took the 4 classical elements of Aristotle: earth, water, air, and fire, and he used them as a filing system to categorize these invisible or semi-visible entities. He recognized that human interactions with the deep earth were fundamentally different from human interactions with the ocean, and the local folklore reflected that difference perfectly.
The folklore was the empirical map.
Exactly.
Let's really dig into this map because the source material goes into incredible conceptual detail here, especially regarding the earth element. This is where the prism's analysis gets so fascinating.
Let's start with earth, yeah. Paracelsus broadly referred to the spirits of the earth as gnomes.
Like the garden gnomes.
Right, but it is highly likely he actually coined this term himself, deriving it from the Greek word gnome, which means knowledge, or specifically the intelligence of the earth.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and this broad category encompasses a massive variety of localized spirits.
Right, the folklore gives us the Korrigans of Brittany, the trolls of Scandinavia, the kobolds of Germanic myth, and where do they always live?
Underneath us.
Underneath us.
Where?
In the deep, dark places. The limestone caves, the winding mine shafts, entangled in the massive roots of ancient trees, or hovering around megalithic stone monuments like the dolmens in France. The lore paints them consistently as guardians.
Guardians of the deep earth.
Yeah, they guard geological secrets, they hoard hidden treasures, veins of precious metals, crystals. They are the keepers of the deep, slow memory of the earth.
Now, here is where the Prism of Odysseus takes Paracelsus's alchemical map and runs it through a highly conceptual, almost physics-based lens. The prism does not view the gnome simply as a grumpy little man with a beard and a pickaxe. The text defines the gnome as the archetype of passive force.
Passive force. Okay, what does that actually mean to a miner swinging a pickaxe in the 1500s?
It means the raw, unyielding resistance of matter. Think about the physical properties of the earth itself. It is dense, it is heavy, it violently resists being moved, being shaped, or being hollowed out.
It pushes back.
Exactly. The gnome embodies that deep, stubborn reality of the physical world. It represents a depth that only yields its secrets, its minerals, its hidden wealth to those who deeply respect its strict, unforgiving laws.
That actually makes total sense. I mean, if you're a 16th century miner deep inside a mountain in Bavaria, the mountain isn't just a collection of rocks to you. It is a terrifying living environment.
Very terrifying.
If you strike the wrong vein, the tunnel collapses. If you dig too deep, you hit a pocket of lethal gas. The earth pushes back. It resists your intrusion.
Exactly. The earth demands respect, it demands caution and knowledge. If you are careless, the passive force crushes you. So the gnome, symbolically and phenomenologically, is the personification of that resistance. When a miner said, the kobolds are angry today, we shouldn't dig, They were expressing an intuitive, empirical read of the geological instability of the rock face, but they translated it through their cultural vocabulary.
It's an incredible survival mechanism encoded as a myth that is brilliant. But the source material goes even further into the Earth category. It specifically highlights beings like the Lutins of Brittany and the Leprechauns of Ireland. And they function a bit differently than the deep mining gnomes, don't they?
They do. Lutins are often described as mischievous house or nature spirits tied to a specific farm or a specific grove of trees. And the leprechaun is famously the solitary cobbler hoarding a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Right.
Both are deeply tied to specific territories. And the prism offers a stunning reinterpretation of what these beings might actually be. It classifies them as territorial egregores.
Territorial egregores. Okay, let's unpack that, because egregore is a pretty heavy occult and philosophical term. Essentially, for the listener, an egregore is a distinct, non-physical entity that arises from the collective focus, thoughts, and emotions of a group of people, like a collective thought form that takes on a life of its own.
Yes, so the prism is suggesting that a lutin or a leprechaun is not a biological creature made of flesh and bone. Rather, it is the cumulative spirit of a specific place that has literally condensed into a recognizable, interactable figure over generations of human intention.
I love this concept. Let's make this relatable for the listener, because we actually experience this all the time without even realizing it. Think about a local, century-old pub in a small village, or maybe a historic, slightly run-down theater in a big city.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
When you walk through those doors, you immediately feel a palpable vibe. The air has a texture to it. It has a mood, an atmosphere that feels almost heavy. That vibe wasn't built in a day. It has been constructed from millions of human interactions, or decades of arguments, celebrations, grief, laughter, anxiety, all of it just soaking into the floorboards.
Absolutely.
Are we saying that these territorial spirits are just that exact localized emotional energy, condensed and anthropomorphized by our ancestors?
That is precisely the argument. Modern psychology might call it an affective atmosphere, but our ancient ancestors didn't have the clinical vocabulary of modern sociology. A Celtic farmer couldn't look at an ancient burial mound and say, the cumulative affective atmosphere of this specific topography combined with generational trauma is currently hostile to human intrusion.
Right. They didn't speak like sociologists. So instead, their perceptual apparatus, their highly attuned nervous system, translates that intense, condensed territorial energy into an image. A lutin guarding its sacred stone. A leprechaun hiding its gold.
Yeah.
And the gold isn't literal, physical coins. The gold represents the hidden value, the latent energy, or the profound mystery of that specific plot of land.
It completely reframes how we view the relationship between humans and their environment. The folklore isn't just a story, it's a dashboard. It's a user interface that ancient cultures developed to interact safely and productively with complex ecological and psychological systems.
A user interface for nature. That is just brilliant. But wait, there's a third type of earth spirit mentioned in the text that has a completely different function. The Nanes. The dwarves, or Dvergar, specifically from the Norse mythology of the Eddas.
The Dvergar are fascinating because they break the mold of the simple, localized nature spirit. In Norse mythology, the dwarves are not just miners. They are the supreme, divine artisans of the cosmos.
Right. They are the ones who forged the artifacts of the gods. They crafted Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. They forged Gleipnir, the impossibly strong magical chain that bound the apocalyptic wolf Fenrir. They spun the golden hair of the goddess Sif. They are creators. They are technologists, in a mythological sense.
And the prism categorizes them in a highly technical, almost futuristic way. It calls the Norse dwarf the BioWare of matter.
BioWare, like hardware or software, but organic.
Yes. So if the gnome represents the raw, stubborn resistance of the stone, the dwarf represents the transmittable, almost divine knowledge of how to overcome that resistance, how to transform raw, dead matter into an instrument of extreme power and signal. They represent the alchemical mastery over physics.
So when an ancient Norse blacksmith was standing at his anvil trying to fold iron and carbon into a perfectly balanced sword, he wasn't just banging a hammer on a rock. He was trying to tap into the BioWare of the metal.
Exactly.
He was trying to commune with the dwarf, the hidden transformative potential locked inside the mineral structure. The dwarf is the personification of metallurgical wisdom.
Exactly. It's a highly functional, sophisticated taxonomy.
Yeah.
The earth provides the resistance, which is the gnome. The environment holds the emotional resonance, the lutin, and the applied knowledge transforms it, which is the dwarf.
That is just, it's a breathtaking way to view ancient human intelligence. They mapped out their entire physical, emotional, and technological relationship with the world through these figures. And Paracelsus didn't just stop at Earth, did he? The source touches briefly on the water element as well.
It does. Paracelsus also categorized the water spirits, the Ondines, the Naiads of Greek myth, the Nixies, the Kelpies in the Scottish Lochs, the Rusalki in Slavic traditions. These entities inhabit the springs, the deep lakes, the flowing rivers, and the falling rain.
And what do they represent in this framework? If Earth is resistance, what is water?
Water embodies fluidity, depth, emotion, and what Paracelsus and later esoteric traditions referred to as the memory of water.
The memory of water, right?
Yeah. Unlike the rigid resistance of Earth, water adapts. It dissolves. It flows around obstacles, yet over time, it can cut through solid rock. The water spirits represent the mysterious, absorbing, and reflective forces of nature. They're often depicted as alluring but incredibly dangerous, capable of pulling you under if you don't respect the currents, both literal and emotional.
I'm tracking all of this, and it is a beautiful philosophical system. But I'm going to push back again.
Go for it.
I'm struggling to see the jump between this 16th century alchemical poetry and the rigorous scientific investigation the prism promises. I mean, we're talking about the energy or vibration of matter, the resistance of the earth, the fluidity of water. It all sounds incredibly abstract. How does the prism justify projecting actual physics onto mythology?
That is the exact pivot point of the entire document. The prism anticipates that exact critique. It argues that this interaction with the forces of nature isn't just an abstract poetic metaphor. It is a deeply, literally physical process.
Okay.
And to explain how human consciousness might actually interact with these physical forces to produce the perception of a spirit, the document actually shifts from extension XC4 to extension XC3.
And this is where we move from the 1500s into the 20th century. Because extension XC3 focuses on one of the most brilliant, enigmatic, and arguably misunderstood minds of the modern era, Nikola Tesla.
Nikola Tesla, the pioneer of alternating current, the inventor of the induction motor, the man who essentially electrified the modern world. Extension XT3 focuses specifically on Tesla's electrical framework and what it calls the law of three forces.
Okay, the law of three forces: active, passive, and neutralizing. Break this down for us. How on earth does alternating current connect to a Celtic fairy?
Let's strip it down to the raw physics of electricity first. In Tesla's framework of creation and energy transfer, you always have forces interacting. Nothing happens in a vacuum. First, you have the active force. This is the current, the electrical signal, the raw energy pushing forward with intent.
Got it. The push.
Then you have the passive force, which, in electrical terms, is resistance.
Wait. Resistance, just like the known we just talked about, the Paracelsian archetype of the resistance of matter.
Exactly. The conceptual parallel is completely seamless. Now, conventional brute force thinking might dictate that to achieve your goal, the active force needs to completely conquer or eliminate the passive force. You want to destroy resistance so the energy can flow freely.
Sure, that sounds logical.
But Tesla, in his genius, understood that you do not seek to defeat resistance.
Because if you completely eliminate resistance in an electrical circuit, what happens? You just get a short circuit.
A total short circuit, exactly.
The energy flashes instantly, overheats, and dissipates into nothing. The system breaks down.
Right. Without resistance, there is no work being done. So Tesla's objective wasn't to destroy the passive force. His objective was to find the conductor, the third force, the neutralizing force.
The neutralizing force, what does that do?
The conductor is the specific environment, the medium, or the precise mechanism that allows the active force, the current, and the passive force, the resistance, to meet in a structured, balanced way. And when they meet through the perfect conductor, they do not destroy each other in a short circuit. Instead, they produce something entirely new, a third phenomenon.
They produce light.
The incandescent light bulb is the ultimate elegant analogy for this. You send an electrical current, the active force, into the bulb. It hits the tungsten filament, which provides severe friction and resistance, the passive force.
Okay.
If you do this in the open air, the filament just catches fire and burns up in a millisecond.
The short circuit.
But if you enclose that interaction inside a glass bulb, and you pump out the oxygen to create a vacuum or fill it with an inert gas like argon, that environment acts as the neutralizing force, it perfectly balances the conflict. And the result of the current fighting the resistance inside that specific environment is sustained. Brilliant illumination.
Okay, my mind is slightly blown right now. So what does this physics lesson mean for our deep dive into folklore? Are we saying that human consciousness, our attention, our intent, our internal energy, is the active force? And the natural environment, the dense forest, the hard rock, the harsh weather, is the passive resistance.
That is the exact breathtaking philosophical extrapolation the prism is making. It applies Tesla's electrical framework directly to human phenomenology. Think about human existence, especially for our ancestors living deeply enmeshed in wild environments. The goal of human life, according to this framework, is not to suppress the resistance of the real. We aren't supposed to pave over every single forest, climate control every room, and numb every difficult human emotion just to make life perfectly easy. The resistance is biologically and spiritually necessary.
Because without the resistance of reality, we are just a short circuit. We generate no light. We generate no meaning.
Precisely. The human objective is to find the exact conductor, the neutralizing force. This could be a highly specific state of mind, a deep meditative focus, an ancient ritual, or a very specific physical environment like the perfect acoustic resonance of a stone circle. The goal is to find the conductor that allows your own internal signal to meet the raw, heavy resistance of reality.
And when that happens perfectly, when the internal human current meets the external environmental resistance inside the right physical or mental conductor, the resulting friction produces a phenomenon, a spark, a burst of perceptual light that could not possibly exist in the human mind alone, nor could it exist in the empty forest alone. It requires the meeting of the two.
And that resulting phenomenon, that spark of interaction, is what our ancestors perceived, categorized, and named as a nature spirit, a fairy, a gnome.
That is unbelievable. It completely redefines the argument. A fairy isn't a hidden biological animal scurrying behind a bush trying to avoid being caught on a trail cam.
No, not at all.
And it isn't just a crazy, baseless hallucination locked inside the skull of a lonely shepherd either. It is an interactive phenomenon. It is the sparks generated by the friction between human consciousness and the deep, raw information fields of nature.
It bridges the gap between physics and psychology perfectly. But the source material doesn't stop at philosophical metaphors. The prism argues that this interaction between subjective human consciousness and physical reality is measurable.
Measurable.
Yes. And to prove that this isn't just modern alchemical theory, it points out that the United States government actually spent millions of dollars trying to prove this exact intersection.
Yes. This brings us to my absolute favorite part of the source documents. We are closing Extension XC3 and opening Extension XC3, and we are talking about the CIA. Specifically, the declassified, heavily analyzed 1983 CIA Gateway Process Report.
This document is a watershed moment in the institutional study of consciousness. The Gateway Process Report was not a fringe conspiracy theory. It was a serious, classified attempt by the military intelligence apparatus to provide a rigid, physical, scientific framework for subjective, altered states of consciousness. We are talking about exploring phenomena like out-of-body experiences, or OBEs.
Which is wild because for decades, mainstream materialistic science just laughed at that stuff. I mean, if a patient came in and said, hey, I meditated so deeply that my consciousness left my physical body and floated up to the ceiling, scientific establishment just patted them on the head and said, you are dreaming, or worse, you're having a psychotic break.
And the reason mainstream science dismissed it wasn't necessarily out of malice, but out of systemic limitation. They lacked a theoretical framework to explain how such a thing could happen physically. If you can't measure it with existing tools, the default institutional position is just rejection.
Right.
But the Gateway Report took a radically different approach. It relied on the work of some incredibly heavyweight pioneering thinkers to try and map the physics of the mind. The source specifically highlights three key figures: David Bohm, Karl Pribram, and Robert Monroe.
Okay, we need to look at these three men because they are heavy hitters and their theories are honestly mind-bending. Let's start with David Bohm. He was a theoretical physicist, arguably one of the significant of the 20th century. He worked alongside Einstein. And Bohm proposed the idea of the holographic universe.
Yes. Bohm argued that the universe we perceive is essentially a giant flowing hologram. And the defining characteristic of a hologram is that every single part of it, no matter how small you slice it, contains the information of the entire whole.
Meaning the entire blueprint of the cosmos is folded into every single atom.
Exactly. The macro is in the micro.
Okay, so Bohm handles the macro physics of the universe. Then you have Karl Pribram, a highly respected pioneering neuroscientist. And Pribram took Bohm's theory and applied it directly to the human brain, proposing the holonomic brain theory. Can you explain this in like 5 terms? Because it's dense.
Absolutely. So traditional neuroscience often viewed the brain like a camera or a computer hard drive, storing literal pictures and files of the outside world. Pribram suggested something radically different. Imagine the brain is not a camera, but an incredibly sophisticated radio antenna.
Okay, an antenna.
According to Pribram, the universe is a massive, swirling symphony of frequencies and wave patterns. That's Bohm's holographic universe. Our brain acts as a tuner. It mathematically interprets those frequencies and wave patterns, translating them to construct the three-dimensional reality we perceive around us.
So we don't see reality as it actually is.
No, we don't see the raw code of the universe. Our brain translates it into a user interface we can understand. Colors, shapes, sounds.
So if the brain is an antenna tuning into reality, what happens if you change the tuning? That brings us to the third figure, Robert Monroe. He wasn't a theoretical physicist or a neuroscientist. He was a radio broadcasting executive in New York who suddenly started having spontaneous, terrifying out-of-body experiences.
Just out of nowhere.
Yeah. But instead of going to a psychiatrist and asking to be heavily medicated, he leaned into it. He set up a laboratory to figure out what the hell was happening to his brain.
And through expensive experimentation, Monroe created a patented audio technology called hemisync. It stands for hemispheric synchronization.
How does it work? What did he actually do in that lab?
Monroe utilized a phenomenon known as binaural beats. If you put stereo headphones on a subject and you play a pure tone of, say, 100 hertz into the left ear and a tone of 104 hertz into the right ear, the brain gets confused, tries to reconcile the difference.
Okay, so slightly different tone in each ear.
Right. And in doing so, the brain itself internally generates a third tone, a beat frequency of exactly 4 hertz, which is the difference between the two.
It essentially creates an acoustic illusion inside your head.
Exactly. But it's more than an illusion. Monroe discovered that by guiding the brain to produce these specific internal frequencies, he could force the electrical patterns of the left and right hemispheres of the brain to perfectly synchronize.
And what happens when the brain achieves hemispheric synchronization?
The subjects repeatedly reported entering profoundly altered states of consciousness. Their physical bodies would fall completely asleep, but their minds remained intensely awake. They reported leaving their bodies, moving through physical walls, and accessing layers of reality completely beyond the physical 5 senses.
They were tuning the antenna to a brand new frequency.
Exactly that.
And the CIA was deeply interested in this because, well, it was the Cold War. They wanted to know if they could use hemisync to train spies in remote viewing, essentially sending their synchronized consciousness into Soviet bunkers to read classified files.
Typical CIA application.
Right. But setting the espionage aside, what is crucial here, as the Prism points out, is the methodology. Bohm, Pribram, and Monroe chose to take subjective human experiences seriously. They didn't reject the phenomena just because Newtonian physics couldn't explain it. They built a new framework.
And if we connect this to the overarching theme of our deep dive, this is exactly the methodology of the Prism of Odysseys. The Prism relies on what it calls the phenomenology of the operator. It demands extreme rigor in analyzing the data, but it does not demand absolute materialistic certainty before it begins an investigation.
Right. It seeks clear distinctions like our epistemic grid from the beginning of the show, rather than outright, arrogant rejection. The source says the Prism seeks a precise resonance between what is established fact, what is currently in research, what is conceptual, and what is speculative.
It weaves all these disciplines together instead of forcing them into silos to fight each other.
Precisely. It uses the advanced physical frameworks of Bohm and Tesla to provide the structural scaffolding necessary to take the subjective, mythological experiences of our ancient ancestors seriously.
It gives them the benefit of the doubt, basically.
Okay, I have a massive thought here. An analogy that I think bridges this entire episode together. I want to run this by you.
Let's hear it.
If the CIA gateway process relied on very specific artificial audio frequencies, those hemisync binaural beats, to alter brainwaves, synchronize the hemispheres, and unlock these profound new perceptions of reality, is it totally possible that our ancestors were doing the exact same thing just naturally?
Oh, follow that thread. How would they do that naturally?
Well, think about everyday life today. Have you ever been driving on a long, straight, boring stretch of highway at night? The hum of the engine is totally consistent, the white lines are flashing by, and suddenly you snap back to reality and realize you have absolutely no memory of the last 10 miles.
Highway hypnosis.
Yes, right. The rhythmic visual and auditory stimulus naturally shifted your brainwaves into an altered, trance-like frequency. Now take that mechanism back 1,000 years. Imagine a Celtic druid, or a Shinto priest, or just a medieval shepherd out working. They're sitting in a perfectly silent, ancient, old-growth forest. Or they are standing inside a megalithic stone circle.
Okay, I see where you're going.
We know for a fact that many of these ancient sites like Newgrange in Ireland or certain cave systems have highly specific, measurable acoustic properties. They have resonant frequencies that literally alter human brainwaves.
They act as natural acoustic chambers.
Exactly. What if the natural environment itself provided the hemisync? The sound of the wind moving through a specific dense pine canopy, the low subaudible hum of a massive waterfall, the specific electromagnetic field generated by a quartz-heavy cave system. Did these ancient people naturally slip into a synchronized, altered state of consciousness just by sitting still in the right spot?
Wow.
Were the famous magical fairy rings of folklore basically just naturally occurring environmental gateway experiences?
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the material, truly. And you aren't just speculating wildly that aligns perfectly with the final conclusions drawn in the text of the prism. You have intuitively touched on the exact mechanism the prism uses to explain the historical reality of the little people.
Which brings us to the grand finale of our deep dive, Section 5, the final canonical position on the little people, as determined by the rigorous investigation of the Prism of Odysseys.
The source brings all these threads together. Paracelsus mapping the resistance of the elements, Tesla's three forces of electrical interaction, the CIA and Monroe's mapping of consciousness as an antenna. It weaves them together to reveal a stunning synthesis. The text concludes, canonically, that fairies exist.
Boom. Wait, let me pause for a second just to make sure the listener heard that clearly. This rigorous, highly analytical framework, this epistemic grid that ruthlessly discarded hoaxes and fairy tales, concludes that fairies exist. But there is a massive, very specific caveat to that statement, isn't there?
A very precise, deeply important caveat. It says they exist at the absolute minimum as one of the longest, most historically persistent, and most universal convergences of human perception towards something that ordinary scientific instruments simply cannot capture.
Okay, we need to unpack that carefully. Towards something, the source explicitly states that this does not mean fairies exist exactly as the bedtime stories describe them.
Right, no tiny wings.
Exactly. Tinkerbell isn't zipping around your garden with physical, biological gossamer wings pollinating the tulips. The Keebler elves aren't baking cookies in a hollow tree.
Correct. The fairy tales, the myths, the specific physical descriptions, those are the cultural clothing wrapped around the raw experience. The prism introduces a vital term here, the integral probe.
The integral probe, what is that? Is it a device?
No, you are the device. The human being is the integral probe. The text argues that when a human being is sufficiently calibrated, meaning their psychological, emotional, and neurophysiological states are perfectly aligned, much like Monroe's hemispheric synchronization.
So an open, receptive, quiet mind, completely in tune with the moment.
Exactly. And when that highly calibrated human is placed in an environment that possesses a dense field of information.
Like the deep, old-growth forest, the quartz cave, the ancient dolmen, or the misty threshold of a river at twilight.
Yes. When that calibrated human probe is in that dense environment, operating in a state of maximum receptivity, they perceive something, a genuine external interactive stimulus.
Wow, okay, so the human nervous system, when tuned correctly and placed in the right environment, is acting like an incredibly sensitive biological radio antenna. It is picking up a subtle frequency, an environmental or energetic signal that a standard materialistic electromagnetic meter is completely blind to.
Absolutely blind to.
And when the human brain receives that raw, strange, profound frequency, it does what human brains do best. It tries to make sense of it.
It translates the raw data.
It translates it. It slaps an image on it based on local cultural expectations and vocabulary. If you are in Ireland, your brain translates that dense territorial energy into a leprechaun. If you are in Japan, your brain translates the silent terror of the deep woods into a yokai. If you are a Norse blacksmith, the hidden potential of the iron becomes a dwarf.
It's all the same signal.
The clothing changes based on geography and era, but the underlying signal of the something is a real interactive feature of the natural world.
This is exactly why the prism demands we take the path of rigorous investigation. The source concludes with a very powerful mandate. It says this something deserves rigorous investigation, neither a rejection for lack of a framework, nor a belief for lack of rigor. The prism chooses investigation.
This completely changes everything about how we view folklore. It elevates it. It tells us that our ancient ancestors weren't just simpletons making up ghost stories to scare kids away from the deep water or the dark woods. They were actively interacting with subtle layers of reality using the most sophisticated, complex sensory probe on the planet, their own calibrated consciousness.
It's incredibly empowering when you think about it.
we shouldn't arrogantly reject their experiences just because our current 21st century scientific frame is too narrow to measure it. But at the same time, we can't just blindly believe every fairy tale without applying critical rigor. We have to, as you said, choose the path of investigation.
It is a profound call for a more expansive, inclusive science. A science that doesn't just measure dead matter in a vacuum, but one that includes the observer, the environment, and the intricate, invisible interactions between them as one unified breathing system.
This has been an absolutely incredible journey today. Thank you so much for guiding us through this dense stack of sources. We've covered massive ground. We started with the universal myths of global cultures, mapping the unseen architecture of nature with Paracelsus and his alchemical gnomes and dwarves.
It was quite the ride.
Then we bridged that historical map into the modern physics of Tesla, understanding how human consciousness and physical resistance meet to create light.
And then taking that concept of the conductor and applying it to the CIA's attempts to map the edges of human consciousness with the gateway process and hemisync, ultimately arriving at the breathtaking realization that the human body itself is the ultimate sensory probe, capable of detecting the invisible forces of the natural world.
It is a huge amount of information to process, but honestly, it feels like a massive, ancient, missing piece of the puzzle of human history has just clicked into place. However, before we wrap up today, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. Something to really chew on during your evening commute or while you're washing the dishes or out walking the dog tonight.
Right. If perceiving these subtle layers of reality, these little people, these territorial egregores, this underlying interactive something requires us to act as calibrated probes existing in states of maximum receptivity, what happens in our modern world.
Yeah, really think about your day-to-day. Look around you. You are likely surrounded by concrete, asphalt, and steel. You are constantly bombarded by digital noise, notifications, pings, emails, and a 24-hour news cycle designed to keep you anxious.
It's endless.
You live your entire life under the glare of artificial LED light that never ever truly gets dark. The heavy, resonant silence of an ancient, old-growth forest is almost impossible for a modern person to find, let alone sit in for hours.
This raises a deeply important and, frankly, deeply unsettling question about the trajectory of human evolution. Have we, through the relentless convenience and noise of our modern lifestyle, effectively decalibrated ourselves?
Have we broken our own antennas?
Exactly. When people ask, where did all the fairies go? Why don't we see them anymore? Are the little people actually gone? Did the magic literally leave the world when the Industrial Revolution started? Or are they still right there, humming in the spaces between the worlds, and we have simply lost the bandwidth required to see the invisible forces right in front of us?
That is a haunting thought. Maybe the magic didn't die at all. Maybe we just went deaf to it. Keep your mind open, stay curious, and the next time you find yourself lucky enough to be in a truly silent, ancient place, put your phone away, take a breath, and pay very close attention to the spaces between the trees. Keep exploring the spaces between the worlds. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.